We are going to talk about quite a bit with Gatsby today. We're going to get into my discussion on chapter one. This is going to be probably a really long video. I'm going to give you some spots to kind of stop, maybe come back to. And I'm going to start by talking, just because I think I've given instruction, but I haven't talked about it, about how this unit is going to work a little bit. So first off, we have a reading schedule. We're reading essentially 3 chapters a week. I want you to read those 3 chapters before our class, whether that class is Thursday or Friday, so that in class and in meets, we can talk about everything that's happening. But groups that are going to be responsible, you guys are going to have a discussion with me. And so you need to plan a time with me sometime early in the week, hopefully on the day that you're reading. So like group 1, I think, has taken chapter 2. Hopefully we're doing that discussion on Tuesday next week and I can post it. And that discussion will be focused on lenses and some things that are kind of technical to think about. And so you're kind of getting double doses of discussion each week. When you pick your chapter, I want you to be aware that you're also picking a lens. So that group 1, their lens is Marxism. So they need to buff up a little bit on Marxism, kind of look over the Bressler notes that I have along with reading chapter 2, and then coming up with a time to talk to me. Discussions will likely take about 40 minutes, so that's going to be a little tricky. When can we have those conversations? When can we set aside some times? So I'm open to even doing it on the weekend. Unfortunately, I have classes on Tuesday and Wednesday at 5:30 to 7, so that kind of clears me off from that time. And I like to take a break between school and school if I can. But just get in contact with me and we'll figure that out. Groups will also prepare a Padlet. If you haven't prepared a Padlet before, just go to Padlet.com. It's super, super easy to make one and then to post it. And I think we'll use discussion boards to post the Padlets. And that way the discussion boards won't be so messy. And we'll do basically the same thing that we did on discussion boards. Padlet works like a little cork board where you would put up sticky notes. And so you just have to put up a couple sticky notes. As I said, I'll record those discussions and then I'll post them on Canvas so that you can go back and watch those discussions, those deeper discussions on the book chapters. And then you can interact with the Padlet. So the Padlet will kind of be like a little bit of the discussion that we had, but also a little bit about the chapter. Just again, make sure that you're finished with the chapters for our Thursday or Friday class, depending on when you come in, and we'll be prepared to talk in class about maybe questions we have or do some actual kind of just what's going on in this book kind of live stuff. As I said, groups, you're responsible for reading ahead, planning, meeting with me, creating discussion questions after our talk, and monitoring those discussions. Individuals, you're responsible for reading 3 chapters a week, watching the accompanying discussions, and responding to the discussion boards in 2 different ways. So that's all the heads up stuff about how to interact with the unit. Of course, I'll post this as well. And that this is a natural stopping point if you want to stop here and think about some other stuff before coming back and hearing my chapter 1 discussion. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about chapter 1 of Gatsby. So first off, let's talk about formalism. Formalism is something that we have talked about before in this class, and we've actually talked about probably since about 6th grade, maybe, when you were first introduced to literary terms. Literary terms are kind of the backbone of formalism. So definitely we're going to talk about symbolism inside of this chapter. We could talk about things like characterization, Structuralism is a little different than formalism, but certainly the structure of the writing and the deep description and also the general, like, how are we looking at this story, are all things that we could talk about with formalism as well. And so I want to start by grabbing my copy and referring to a lot of the lines, because the language in this book is really, really rich. And we're going to get into the talk about language. Like anybody you encounter when you're talking about Gatsby, you have to talk about the language. And the language is essentially, looking at language is essentially a formalist exercise. We'll get into more of that language in a minute, but let's go ahead and look at the first 2 pages. I'm actually going to read these aloud for some emphasis and stop as I'm talking. So let's especially pay attention to this first line. In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in the world haven't had the advantages you've had. So we are immediately thrown into this thought about class and privilege. And that's going to be a lot of the backbone of the book. We also get this kind of, is this authentic advice from his father? Why is Nick repeating this? Why is Nick opening the book like this? Good questions to ask, and we'll get around to some of them. He didn't say any more, but we've always been unusually communicative in a reserved way, and I understood that he meant a great deal more than that. In consequence, I am inclined to reserve all judgments, a habit that has opened up many curious natures to me and also made me the victim of a few veteran bores. The abnormal mind is quick to detect and attach itself to this quality when it appears in a normal person, and so it came about that in college I was unjustly accused of being a politician because I was privy to the secret griefs of wild, unknown men. Most of the confidences were unsought. Frequently I have feigned sleep, preoccupation, or a hostile levity when I realized that some unmistakable sign that an intimate revelation was quivering on the horizon. For the intimate revelations of young men, or at least the terms in which they express them, are usually plagiaristic and marred by obvious suppressions. Reserving judgments is a matter of infinite hope, and I am still a little afraid of missing something if I forget that, as my father snobbishly suggested, and I snobbishly repeat, a sense of the fundamental decency is parceled out unequally at birth. So here we have Nick professing something about himself. I do not judge other people. And I think we want to take that with a big, big grain of salt, because that is a pretty loud thing to say, especially at the beginning of the book. I am not going to judge people. And then look at what he does. He tells us, in college, I was so unwilling to give my opinion that people saw me as this politician. They started to confide in me. And then he describes their confessions as like obvious and plagiarized and kind of stupid. He's literally making judgments about how people are talking to him. And so we have to question some things from Nick pretty quickly here. And just like you would probably question somebody who is like, I am very trustworthy. People don't say things like that. We infer that they're trustworthy through their actions, right? And so we want to be careful about people who make these proclamations about how good they are. I am not a judgmental person. If you say that out loud, chances are maybe you're a judgmental person. And after boasting this way of my tolerance, I came to the admission that it has a limit. Conduct may be founded on the hard rock or the wet marshes, but after a certain point, I don't care what it's founded on. When I came back to the East last autumn, I felt that I wanted the world to be in uniform and at a sort of moral attention forever. I wanted no more riotous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. Only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him, some heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, as if he were related to one of those intricate machines that registers earthquakes 10,000 miles away. This responsiveness had nothing to do with that flabby, impressionable which is dignified under the name of creative temperament. It was an extraordinary gift of hope, a romantic readiness such as I have never found in any other person, and which it is not likely I shall ever find again. No, Gatsby turned out all right in the end. It is what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. So we want to look at what is he really saying here, because he's using so many words to express not simple ideas either. So we have complication about complication, right? But he says he has unaffected scorn for everything that Gatsby represents, and yet the book is called The Great Gatsby after this man. He says that Gatsby turned out all right in the end. And we know that Nick has left the East. So this whole story is being told as, from a future standpoint, right? And we know that things did not go well out East. So we have a lot going on in these first couple pages, and it's pretty structurally interesting that now we know the story is being told from a narrator who maybe we don't rely too much on, who boasts a little too much, and we also know all the events have already happened. They're not unraveling in front of us. They've already happened before. And that's going to play a big part in how we think about the book. So let's go ahead and step back and instead of just getting into all the formula stuff, what actually happens in this chapter? Well, we meet Nick, and what do we learn about Nick? Well, we learn he's very wealthy. He comes from the Midwest. He comes from a city in the Midwest. We don't know exactly where that is. But we do learn that he comes from a series of wealthy people who made their money in supply chains. His grandfather was so wealthy that he paid someone to fight in the Civil War for him. That's a very specific kind of wealth. We learned that Nick went to New Haven, which is Yale, if you don't know. So he's wealthy enough to go to an Ivy League school, and getting into Yale in 1920 would be totally different than getting into Yale in 2020. So we know wealth has more to do with that then than it does now. We also know that he goes out east. So he grows up, he goes to Yale, and then he goes into the Army. During World War I, he comes out of the Army, and he feels like the Midwest is too small for me. I want to go out east. And his father is able to completely support him for an entire year, as Nick is like, maybe I want to learn the stock business. So that's really, really wealthy. And we should point out, we will find this out later in the book, Nick is 29. So just imagine being 29 and your parents are willing to support you 100% financially to just go out to New York City for a year. That's a lot of wealth, right? That's wealth that probably nobody in Afton has. He in this meager salary can afford a house in the country. He can afford a car, and he can afford like this housekeeper servant who he calls his Finn, because she's a Finnish woman. So he is living pretty large. Yes, he lives in a shack next to a mansion, but he's paying $80 a month for it. I think we've done this calculation in the past or something, and that's like essentially $1,000 a month for a nice little house next to all these mansions. He does go out to the East to study the stock market. That's his intention. He was going to live in the city, but then he got this offer. And so he ends up living in between these two. Well, he lives on one side of these two eggs. He lives in West Egg. We'll get into the geography of that a little later because I think that's really important. And he meets up with his cousin. Daisy's his second cousin once removed. If anybody can explain that to me, then I'd love to hear it. But, tenuous when we say cousin. And her husband, Tom, who he went to Yale with. They were friends. Friends is maybe too strong a word for what he and Tom were. But they were in the same social club, which I think means fraternity here. And so they knew each other from that association. He also meets Jordan Baker, who is a friend of Daisy's from her time in Louisville. So childhood friend. This book is really a book of parties. We're going to see that. We're going to go to party after party after party. And we may not see this as a party, but I think it certainly is. Like it's the type of party that you have with where there's like one couple and then you're there and then like somebody else is there and you're like, oh, this is awkward. It's that type of party. We see like the ungodly wealth of Tom and Daisy. They just kind of moved into this giant mansion on East Egg. We get these descriptions of Tom and Daisy, like they lived in Chicago and then they like got tired of that. So they went to France. They lived in France for a year and now they're tired of that. So now they're in East Egg in Long Island. And we get the sense that they kind of just move around the world. They have so much wealth they can do that. Tom has a whole team of polo ponies that he moves from place to place every time he moves. Like the amount of wealth that these people have is really, really hard to really understand. We should mention we're in the 20s, so we're in the midst of Prohibition, and yet everybody is drinking. They're drinking all throughout this evening. We have this kind of grittiness to the story where we get all this stuff popping up at the beginning of the book. We have maybe Tom is having an affair with a woman in New York. Daisy is super depressed. We have Tom is clearly a racist. The interaction between Tom and Daisy tell you that they don't really like each other. And like Jordan is kind of somebody who likes to watch all of the drama unfold, right? She's, I don't know if we'd say she's a gossip, but she's certainly like a voyeur of a kind. And so, here Nick is kind of entering into this world that seems totally different from anything that he's ever seen before. And this is a common thing for a writer to do, right? He introduces us to a character that should be kind of close to ourselves, and that character is then going to reveal the world that we see, and that way we get to kind of interact with that world. So all of that is kind of standard, but here we have a lot going on in a chapter where it seems like very little is going on. We'll talk about the eggs in a minute, but let's talk about the characters that we're with first, and then we can get into that. So Tom, I want you to think about how Tom is portrayed in the story. Like he is pretty ridiculous. I dare say, like we would say he's the pinnacle of toxic masculinity in the way that we would talk about him now. But on page 7, we get like, he had changed since his New Haven years. Now he was a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30, with a rather hard mouth and a supercilious smile. 2 shining, arrogant eyes had established dominance over his face and gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward. Not even the effeminate swank of his riding clothes could hide the enormous power of that body. He seemed to fill those glistening boots until he strained the top lacing. You could see a great pack of muscle shifting when his shoulder moved under his thin coat. It was a body capable of enormous leverage, a cruel body. And we'll get into some of these descriptions again when we get to feminism and when we get to queer theory. But Tom is being painted as like, the perfect male body, but somehow it's still grotesque. And I think if you want to think of him in a way, think of like the animated Beauty and the Beast version of Gaston, who's super muscly and gorgeous, but just really offending in kind of all of his mannerisms. And then if that's not enough, then he's got to go into this, racist rant about, we're the Nordic people and we've created all of society. We've created anything that's good in all of culture, and everybody else wants to take down what we have, and it's our job to beat them back, right? Again, this is language coming out of somebody from the 1920s, and it would have been distasteful then, but man, I think there are a lot of people who would talk that way now, right? So we'll get to that when we get to new historicism, how much of this book is still relevant. And then, if that weren't enough, he's clearly cheating on his wife, right? So Fitzgerald is really setting Tom up to be kind of just blatantly the villain of the piece, right? He's just such a jerk. He's so unlikable. And then who are we going to contrast him with, right? Well, Nick's not a good contrast for Tom. Nick is just kind of going to go along with whatever people say. So Nick isn't a good enough contrast for Tom. So we know that somebody is going to come along and contrast with him. That's just the way decent writing works. How about Daisy? So if Tom is kind of described as the prototypical man, I think Daisy is described as the prototypical, unfortunately, the prototypical woman in the 20s who is still kept, who is still, unable to experience the world on her own terms, right? It's either got to be on her parents' terms or her husband's terms. Again, something to really talk about when we get to feminism. She's referred to as a flower and a golden girl. And we get, those are powerful images when we start talking about women as flowers, and she blooms for some people. We start to see her come alive for some people. So how her mood is reflected in how open she is. Of course, there's some other metaphors there that we're not going to talk about. But just know, we're wrapped up in symbolic language. Her name is Daisy, and she's described as a flower. She puts on a good face about the affair, but we could see that superficialness of, everything's fine, kind of dissipate as the evening goes on, probably as the drinks are flowing a little more, although we will learn Daisy doesn't really drink. But she also, in her own way, kind of holds her own against Tom, right? She calls him hulking. He's like, I don't like that word. She hits him again with it. She kind of poo-poos a lot of his ideas. When Tom notices that that she was talking with Nick alone, he's like, "What are you talking about?" She's like, "Oh, the Nordic race and how great we are." And as he's going on, he's like, he reads books, so she's just good about getting in those digs. And it seems like every year that I teach this book, we all know a Tom and Daisy. We all know that kind of power couple that look good together, and they are really awful for each other. And that, if there's anything that really I think we take away that echoes throughout the book that comes from chapter 1, it's that Tom and Daisy have a daughter. We don't know her name. We never meet her. Nick never sees this daughter in chapter 1. And then we get this story, this heartbreaking story about Tom wasn't even there when the child was born. She wanted him the girl to be a boy. She's disappointed. And then she goes, it's okay as long as she's a beautiful little fool, because that's the best thing a girl can be in this world, is a beautiful little fool. And maybe the implication there is that Daisy is not a fool, right? Maybe she wants her own daughter to be as beautiful as she is, but dumb enough that she doesn't know when she's being taken advantage of. And so we get this huge amount of sorrow from Daisy. I wonder if we like Daisy at the end of this chapter. Do we like her? Do we sympathize with her? Do we empathize with her? These are some good questions to ask as we're interjecting with the text. She's also rich in her own right. She comes from Louisville. Maybe when I show you the eggs, I'll show you some pictures of the types of houses that she would have come from in Louisville. She's what we would know as a debutante. So there's a whole culture there that doesn't go too explored, but is certainly very key. That, she's a Southern girl, she's a good girl, she's a girl that comes up from a whole lot of money on her own, and then her fortune pales compared to Tom's. So we know that contrast. Of course, we have to talk about Jordan Baker. Jordan is a golfer. She's a professional golfer. I think that alone is interesting. It tells us that she's an independent woman in some ways. We get that echoed to us again when Tom says, like, she's a good girl, but her, she goes around the whole country, and they let her. And Nick's like, who lets her? And Tom's like, her parents are too permissive. So we get that contrast. There's a contrast between Jordan and Daisy. They grow up together, they're childhood friends, but Jordan has the kind of freedom as a single woman with a career that Daisy doesn't have. Nick is clearly attracted to Jordan, although, it's kind of interesting the way he describes her. I don't think I've ever been attracted to a woman and nudged my friend and said, oh, she has such an erect carriage. What a weird way to be attracted to somebody. And reading that description of Jordan Baker is definitely something that we'll do again when we come to queer theory, is we should probably read like every description of characters really closely when we think about that. So we'll get back to that description again at some point. So Jordan, she's going to represent some stuff, right? She also has this kind of mischievousness to her. She seems to control Nick quite a bit from the get-go. He seems to have no idea what's going on. And she's like, shut up. I want to listen to all this juicy gossip that's going on between Tom and Daisy, even though she lives with them for the summer and could probably just talk to Daisy about it. She seems to love the drama of everything. And who can blame her? We all love the drama. We end the book, we end the question, the section, the chapter, with this moment where Nick goes home. He's been told about Gatsby. He's seen Gatsby's house. And he sees Gatsby like walk to the end of his dock and stretch his arm out to this green light in the distance on the other side of the Long Island Sound. Again, I'll give you the geography in a minute here. And then Gatsby just like Nick stops paying attention to him for a second. And he's like, I wonder if I should approach him. And then he looks back and like Gatsby's gone. So what a weird way to end this chapter, right? With this like just super, super obvious symbol that we're thrown in, the symbol of the green light, right? And so this is a really good example of like there are times where even great authors are like, you cannot miss this symbol. This is super, super important. And I'm going to have somebody reaching their hand out to touch it. That's how clear I want it to be that it's a symbol. So now we're forced to think about like, well, what is the green light? What does it represent? And so we can look at color meanings. And if we were sitting around, it'd be fun to shoot down all your weird ideas about what colors mean. But here are kind of the basics. Like when we think of green, we might think of money or greed. Both of these are genuinely thought of as green, especially in America where our money is green, or called greenbacks sometimes. That's how our money is referred to. And, weirdly, I think that's a 1920s expression, maybe not. We also think about green as like kind of ghostly ethereal. If you grew up and watched any Scooby-Doo, like the ghosts always have this green aura around them. Of course, green is also the color of envy, of wanting something that you can't have, right? So green has a lot of different meanings. And there's one that none of you would come up with, and I definitely wouldn't come up with if I didn't know it, which is this is a light at the end of a dock. So green is there to let boats know the light is shining, on and off, to let boats know that there's a dock there so they don't run into them. So green is actually also a stop sign in this case. And from what I understand, early on when we had the first cars, the first stoplights were green is stop. It took a little while for that to turn to red, and green became go. So we associate green with go, but the 1920s, green would have been associated with stop. So we have a lot going on with this one little symbol. What does it mean? Does it mean all these things? Does it mean one of these things? Why is this man, reaching his hand out towards it as if to try to grasp it? We don't know. That's one of the most compelling things I think about chapter 1 is we're like, what's going on here? I want to know a little bit more. So things to question from just again a formalist view. One thing is to think, is Nick a reliable narrator? It's a good question. Again, I wanted you to think about that with the introduction of Nick and saying like, my father gave me this advice to not judge people based on what they came from. And then I took that advice to heart until I didn't. I've always tried not to judge people, and then goes on to judge people, right? And does Nick judge people throughout chapter 1? I don't know, it's kind of interesting. It doesn't seem like he judges Tom. It doesn't necessarily seem like he judges Daisy or Jordan. He doesn't have enough of an interaction to judge Gatsby. So is he true to his word? Does he try not to be judgmental and sometimes he slips? Is he actually judgmental and he just professes not to be? Do we trust everything that he's saying? These are good questions to kind of enter the book with. Also, I want us to think, do you like any of the characters? Do you think any of them are likable? They might be interesting, but likable is a different word than interesting. And so what happens if we have a book with a bunch of characters that we don't like? Can that be a satisfying story for us? Or are we going to fall in love with some of these characters? Is that a possibility? Certainly chapter 1 is too early to determine. We also can't leave chapter 1 without talking about just the elevated and elegant language inside of this book. The language is hard to get used to. I always encourage everyone to read chapter 1 twice, just because you have to get used to this weird rhythm that Fitzgerald has. And in a way, the language is so elegant that it stops being as functional as it should be. Nick is never just going to tell us, like, Gatsby was this weird guy and he was standing out of his dock and he was reaching his hand out for this green light. And I was like, I don't know if I want to talk to him or not. And then I turned away and like he wasn't there anymore. He's got to say it in this flowery kind of majestic, almost magical kind of way. And it makes us almost feel like there's a fairy tale going on. It also kind of prevents us from seeing all the detail. It's like he has so many details that it's hard to see all of them. And sometimes it's even hard to see some of the fact that's going on, which is why we should definitely review like what's happened in the chapters is one of the first things that we talk about in discussions, because it's going to be pretty easy to miss things. In fact, I think this might be my 20th time reading Gatsby, and I guarantee you I'm finding new things every time I read it, just because the language is so dense. I think this time around I hadn't realized what they were talking about while the phone was ringing, and that they were talking about taking a trip to the stables, and they were all just going to walk around and see the horses, and then the phone rang, and like that conversation just dissipated into the air like dust. That's powerful, right? To think like that phone call just ruined a positive experience that they could have had that evening. So just thinking about like, why is he writing this way? Why is he challenging the reader with dense prose. And is it just to keep us away? Is it just to kind of keep us interested? Is it just the way that he writes? Or is there something else kind of involved here? And I might offer, just as a suggestion, that I've read other Fitzgerald and nothing reads like Gatsby, and it just might be that Gatsby is a masterwork and that it all comes together. Um, it doesn't all have to be planned intricately out, but this is a heavily edited book. In fact, I like to drop things about Fitzgerald as we have discussions. He literally died with his own copy of Gatsby. He carried it around with him all the time, and he was making personal edits into that book until the day he died. So it is clearly a work that was very important to the author, and one that he was constantly coming back to. Just to round this out with a little geography lesson, we are looking at New York. Of course, here's the state of New York. If you didn't know, New York City is like very much at the southernmost point of New York. It is flanked by, you can see Pennsylvania is very close. New Jersey is here, and then we have Connecticut. So this is called the tri-state area, usually. New Haven, Yale is right there. So these are people who are pretty familiar with this area from going to college around there. So the eggs are actually, this is New York City. New York City, of course, we have the island of Manhattan, and then we get into the Bronx and all the different little areas around there. And the eggs are just outside of Queens. So these are the eggs right here. When Nick is referring to the Long Island Sound, he is referring to this area between the islands here. And we have the East Egg, right? This is the place where the really, really rich, the old wealthy live. And then we have West Egg, which is where the new wealthy live. And Tom's house is like right over here, and Gatsby's house is right over here. So that kind of gives us a little bit of a sense of where we are. To add a little bit, I talked about Louisville. The kind of mansions in Louisville that are kind of old standing, like this is the type of home that Daisy would have grown up in as a debutante in the South. Or let me see, maybe something like this. But that kind of gives you a little bit of a sense of the wealth of these types of people. Let's see if we can get mansions in East Egg. So this is a shot from the movie of Tom's house, and we get like these are the types of places. This might be like Gatsby's house, if you want to get a sense for the type of wealth that we're talking about here. So those visuals, I think, really help us to understand something about the book.